The radar room inside the USS Michael Murphy is freezing cold. Outside, the air over the Gulf of Oman is suffocating. It is April 27th. The year is 2026. A young petty officer is staring at a tactical display. That display should be tracking rusty Iranian patrol boats. Instead, it is lighting up with signatures that belong in the South China Sea. 3 massive vessels. They were not invited. They were not announced. They simply arrived in the dark. The largest of them is not built to sink other ships. It is a monster of a vessel called the Yuanwang 7. 30,000 tons of steel, bolted beneath a forest of parabolic antennas and sensory arrays. Listen, you need to understand what this ship actually is. It is a floating supercomputer. Think about standing on an empty beach. You can see maybe a few hundred yards down the shoreline. Now hand a man binoculars that let him read the encrypted data link of an F-35 fighter jet from 1,000 miles away. That is the Yuanwang 7. China calls it a tracking ship. The reality is much darker. It creates a sensory bubble. That bubble stretches across the entire Middle East. It hears every radio call from every American destroyer. It tracks every drone taking off from Al Udeid Air Base. It is sitting right now less than 100 miles from the exact spot where the United States Navy just promised to build an impenetrable wall of steel. Now, stay with me here. The headlines this morning said the crisis was over. Donald Trump stood at a podium. He declared a total naval blockade of all Iranian ports. He promised to board any vessel carrying Iranian crude. The press cheered. Wall Street rallied. Story over. Except, it wasn't. What actually happened behind those closed doors was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Pentagon designed this blockade assuming they were only fighting a crippled Iranian regime. They were wrong. Mojtaba Khamenei did not panic when the blockade was announced. He did not send his battered navy to fight a suicidal war. He picked up a phone. He called Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping moved the board. A floating supercomputer is useless in a firefight. It cannot defend itself against American torpedoes. So Xi Jinping did not send the Yuanwang 7 alone. He sent 2 bodyguards. The first is the Type 055 destroyer Dalian. This is the most heavily armed surface warship the People's Liberation Army Navy has ever built. 13,000 tons of displacement. 112 vertical launch cells built right into the deck. Each cell is loaded with YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship missiles. Think of it as a floating fortress with the ability to saturate an American carrier strike group from 300 miles away. The second escort is the Type 052D destroyer Shaman. Slightly smaller, 64 launch cells. But just as lethal, these 2 ships together carry roughly the same combined firepower as an entire American carrier escort group. That is what is sitting in the Gulf of Oman right now. A floating supercomputer that can see everything. Protected by 2 of the most heavily armed warships on the planet. And every single American destroyer enforcing Trump's blockade is currently being painted by their fire control radars. Which leads directly to the second problem. China is not just here to watch. China has a bleeding economic artery. And that artery runs straight through the Strait of Hormuz. Every refinery in Shanghai, every manufacturing hub in Shenzhen, every diesel truck supplying food to mainland China. A massive portion of that machinery runs on Iranian crude. Xi Jinping imports roughly 1.4 million barrels of that oil every single day. Those barrels sit on tankers. Those tankers are currently hiding in Iranian ports. Under the new rules set by Donald Trump, every single one of those tankers is a military target. This is the math that breaks the American strategy. The blockade does not just choke Mojtaba Khamenei. The blockade suffocates Xi Jinping at the gas pump. And China cannot afford to lose this supply line. So China physically placed military assets in the exact waterway where America plans to enforce the law. Pause here for a moment. Let that sink in. American destroyers are operating in the same tight waters as Chinese hypersonic missile cruisers. American boarding teams are preparing to fast rope onto tankers, while the Chinese Navy watches every single movement. What happens at the exact moment of contact? This is the nightmare scenario nobody in Washington wants to admit. An Iranian tanker named the Suez Rajan leaves Karg Island. An American destroyer moves to intercept, but right next to that tanker is the Type 055 Dalian. What does the American captain do? Does he order 20 armed sailors onto a ship protected by a Chinese cruiser? If he does, Xi Jinping has a casus belli, a justified reason for war. Under international maritime law, China can interpret an armed boarding of a vessel under its military protection as an act of naked aggression. But if the American captain backs down, the blockade is dead. The tanker sails away. The footage hits the internet, and the entire world realizes that the United States Navy just blinked. To understand why this trap snapped shut so perfectly yesterday, you have to rewind exactly 10 years, to a series of quiet banking agreements signed in Beijing. China spent a decade building a shadow financial system. They buy this oil using the Chinese yuan. They process it through banks that have zero exposure to Wall Street. They built an entire economic ecosystem designed specifically to bypass American sanctions. That ecosystem only survives if the oil keeps flowing. If the United States Navy seizes those tankers, the yuan oil market collapses on live television. Every country watching, from Saudi Arabia to Brazil, will see that China cannot protect its own currency. Xi Jinping is not protecting a tanker. He is protecting the future of his empire. And Mojtaba Khamenei knew exactly how to force him into the fight. Let me walk you through exactly how this works. You do not just hide a supertanker from the most advanced military on Earth. You hide it in plain sight using a legal and tactical labyrinth. Break it down to the math. The United States Navy operates under strict rules of engagement. When a boarding team leaves the USS Michael Murphy on a rigid hull inflatable boat, they need clear physical access to the target vessel. But Xi Jinping is employing a naval tactic called dynamic radar shadowing. The Chinese Type 055 destroyer Dalian does not just sail vaguely near the Iranian tanker. It physically places its 13,000 tons of steel directly between the American ship and the target. If the American boat tries to steer around the blockade, the Chinese ship deliberately adjusts its course to cut them off. It is a massive game of maritime chicken, played with hypersonic missiles on a chessboard the size of a city, but it gets infinitely more complicated. Look at the electronic warfare environment. That floating supercomputer, the Yuanwang 7. It is not just passively listening to the radio chatter, it is actively jamming the specific encrypted frequencies used by American boarding teams. The radio's cut out, the drone feeds suddenly go black. The American commander on the bridge of the destroyer realizes he cannot see or hear his own men in the water. You cannot authorize a hostile boarding operation if you cannot communicate with the assault team. That is the trap. It is an autonomous denial zone, created not by physical mines or incoming bullets, but by calculated legal ambiguity and overwhelming electronic suppression. Now, let me walk you through exactly how the money moves in the background, because the military standoff is merely the visible tip of the spear. When Mojtaba Khamenei sells 1 million barrels of crude oil to Xi Jinping, not a single American dollar changes hands. The transaction happens entirely on the cross-border interbank payment system. China calls this CIPS. It is their sovereign alternative to the Western SWIFT network. The money moves from the People's Bank of China directly into an Iranian account held in a localized branch in Shanghai. The United States Treasury cannot freeze this money. The CIA cannot track the digital footprint. It is a complete financial ghost. And because the digital money is utterly untouchable, Donald Trump is forced to target the physical oil itself. That dynamic forces the United States Navy into the exhausting role of a global highway patrol. But Xi Jinping anticipated this exact move. Chinese state-owned insurance companies underwrite these specific Iranian vessels. If an American ship fires a single warning shot across the bow of a tanker, the Chinese government immediately files an international grievance. They claim America is attacking a civilian vessel under their sovereign financial guarantee, which leads directly to the sheer absurdity of the financial bleeding. Think about that for a second. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer costs roughly $2 billion to build. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars every single day just to keep it floating in the Gulf of Oman. Donald Trump has deployed entire strike groups to this tiny choke point. We are talking about tens of billions of dollars in advanced hardware, burning millions in aviation fuel every week, risking the lives of thousands of American sailors. And what exactly are they fighting? They are not fighting a modern Iranian armada. They are fighting a shadow fleet of decaying rust bucket tankers, insured by anonymous shell companies in Hong Kong, flying fake maritime flags from Liberia or Panama. A $3 million interceptor missile, fired from a $2 billion warship, to intimidate a disposable vessel that is artificially protected by a Chinese tracking ship. This is not a battle. This is a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. Every hour that the USS Michael Murphy spends burning specialized maritime fuel while staring blankly at a Chinese destroyer, Mojtaba Khamenei is successfully selling another 100,000 barrels of oil. The asymmetry is absolutely staggering. America is utilizing its most expensive military assets to enforce a localized traffic stop, while Xi Jinping utilizes the mere threat of a traffic collision to rewrite the entire global world order. And right now, you might be thinking this is a geopolitical chess game that does not affect you. You probably think this is just an abstract problem for naval officers and Wall Street traders. Except, it is not. Pause and look at your grocery receipt from this morning. Look at the numbers on the gas pump. When an American destroyer and a Chinese cruiser lock horns in a tense standoff, the global shipping insurance market completely panics. Lloyd's of London just raised the risk premium for any commercial vessel entering the Middle East by 300%. Those massive insurance premiums get passed directly onto the cargo. Brent crude is instantly spiking. It is currently hammering against $116 a barrel. Gasoline is sitting at $4.17 a gallon. It will breach $5 by next Tuesday if a single shot is fired in the Gulf. Diesel is soaring even faster. Every single truck that delivers food to your local supermarket runs exclusively on that diesel. Bread is up 14%. Heating oil is up 22%. You are paying for this standoff every single time you swipe your credit card. This is the absolute brutal reality of modern warfare. The missiles do not actually have to fly to destroy your life savings. The engineered fear alone is enough to completely drain your wallet. While Donald Trump and Xi Jinping lock eyes over a stretch of poisoned water, Vladimir Putin is the one actually smiling in the shadows. Putin is the ultimate vulture in this geopolitical theater. He understands the mathematics of distraction better than anyone alive. For the past several years, the Russian military machine has been completely locked in a war of attrition. Now, suddenly, the entire American intelligence apparatus is pivoting aggressively away from the European theater. They are hyper-focusing entirely on the Gulf of Oman. Spy satellites operated by the National Reconnaissance Office are physically shifting their orbits. They are moving their highly classified lenses away from Russian rail yards. They are pointing them directly at Chinese tracking ships in the Middle East. This is the hidden diplomatic dividend of the blockade. Every single hour that the Pentagon spends stressing over Mojtaba Khamenei is an hour that Russian supply lines operate without any American interference. Every single Tomahawk missile that is loaded onto the USS Michael Murphy is a weapon system that cannot be deployed to defend European airspace. Putin is watching the United States willingly drain its strategic reserves to fight over a waterway it cannot completely control. And it is not just Putin who is profiting immensely from this engineered chaos. Look at the commodity traders in Geneva. Look at the shadow logistics fleets operating out of Dubai. Giant trading firms are watching the shipping routes freeze in real time. They are instantly redirecting their private fleets around the Cape of Good Hope. They are deliberately charging triple the standard freight rates for the exact same cargo. They are turning this terrifying military standoff into the most profitable financial quarter in modern corporate history. War is a catastrophic tragedy for the average American taxpayer. But for the elite commodity brokers, war is an incredibly lucrative business model. That brings us directly to the ultimate point of systemic failure. The illusion of absolute control always shatters in a single unscripted moment. It happened exactly 48 hours ago. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth walked into the Pentagon press briefing room. The time was shortly after midnight. He stepped up to the podium to project absolute American resolve. He read a prepared statement about the ironclad nature of the naval blockade. He used aggressive language. He promised overwhelming retaliation. But then a reporter from Reuters asked an incredibly specific off-script question. The reporter asked how the United States Navy planned to physically board a tanker if the Chinese cruiser Dalian activated its active electronic jamming systems. Hegseth paused. He looked down at his notes. He looked back up at the cameras. He stammered for exactly 4 agonizing seconds. He muttered something incomprehensible about operational security and abruptly walked away from the microphone. He did not go to his armored SUV. He walked into the hallway and made a frantic encrypted phone call. That is not the behavior of a superpower firmly in control of the global board. That is the absolute panic of a man who just realized his bluff has been fundamentally called. The entire world watched that 4-second hesitation on live television. Xi Jinping watched it in Beijing. Mojtaba Khamenei watched it in Tehran. Vladimir Putin watched it in Moscow. They all saw the exact same fundamental glitch in the American armor. The glitch is the terrifying realization that the United States simply cannot afford to fight a two-front naval war. The Pentagon has the advanced hardware. The Pentagon has the stealth fighters. But Washington absolutely lacks the political capital to absorb the catastrophic casualties that a direct conflict with China would inevitably bring. This is where the timeline branches into two very distinct and violent futures. The situation in the Gulf of Oman is no longer just a localized maritime dispute. It is a brutal stress test for the entire architecture of global power. Either Donald Trump authorizes a kinetic strike and triggers a devastating global depression, or he orders his destroyers to back down and quietly hands control of the oceans to Beijing. There is no comfortable diplomatic middle ground left to stand on. The era of uncontested American maritime supremacy is currently bleeding to death in the water. So here is the terrifying choice. Are we watching a localized strategic delay? Or are we witnessing the permanent orchestrated collapse of American global dominance? Write delay or collapse in the comments right now. When you see someone who vehemently disagrees with your assessment, tell them exactly why their geopolitical math is dangerously wrong. Leave your permanent mark on this historical moment. Because 6 months from now, when the global supply chains are permanently fractured and the old rules no longer apply,